5 years ago, I sat in that cold, sterile office, my fingers clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached. My heart pounded against my ribs as I watched Richard Calloway lean back in his leather chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing at his lips. I had worked for this moment, sacrificed weekends, pulled countless all-nighters, delivered results that had propelled the company forward. Everyone knew it. This promotion was supposed to be mine. But Richard Calloway had other plans. "You're good, Eleanor," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "But you're not leadership material. Some people just aren't meant to climb higher." I felt the floor beneath me shift, my stomach dropping into a pit of disbelief. But he held up a hand, cutting me off, as if my words were nothing more than an inconvenience. "Look, I need someone who commands respect, someone with presence. You're a hard worker, but you don't have that edge." That edge. The vague, meaningless excuse that wrapped his real reasoning in just enough ambiguity to remain unchallenged. I knew exactly what it meant. I wasn't ruthless enough in his eyes. I wasn't willing to play the underhanded corporate games he thrived on. I was simply too young, too careful, too unwilling to manipulate my way up the ladder like he had. I left his office that day feeling humiliated, angry, but most of all, determined. That night, I made a decision. If this company wasn't going to give me what I deserved, I would take it somewhere else, and I would build something better. 5 years later, I adjusted the cuffs of my blazer as I stepped into the glass-walled conference room, the weight of a multi-million-dollar deal hanging in the air. The room was silent, tense. The men seated across from me knew what was at stake. I wasn't just in the room anymore. I owned the room. Reed and Company had started as nothing more than an idea, a whisper of defiance against the injustice I had endured. I had built it from the ground up, driven by the fire Richard Calloway had ignited in me. And in just a few years, my company had skyrocketed, leaving my former competitors scrambling to keep up. Some of them had adapted, others had crumbled under the weight of their own outdated ways. And today, one of those struggling firms had come crawling for an acquisition deal. A failing firm, drowning in losses, desperate for a lifeline. And leading their delegation, Richard Calloway. The sight of him was almost laughable. He still wore the same expensive suits, but they no longer carried the effortless arrogance they once did. His face was more drawn, his once sharp posture stiff with unease. His company was dying, and he knew it. But what struck me most wasn't the exhaustion lining his face. It was the flicker of disbelief in his eyes when he saw me. He never thought I'd rise higher than him. He never thought he'd be the one sitting across from me, waiting for my decision. "Ms. Reed," he said carefully, the arrogance from years ago nowhere to be found. I took my seat at the head of the table, folding my hands in front of me, letting a slow smile form. "Mr. Calloway," I replied. "Let's discuss your future, shall we?" The power had shifted, and this time I was the one holding all the cards. I let the silence stretch between us, watching as Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The man who had once dismissed me so easily now looked unsure, his fingers twitching against the folder in front of him. I could tell he hated this, hated being on the other side of the power dynamic. 5 years ago, he had held all the leverage, and he had used it to crush me without a second thought. Now it was my turn. "Before we begin," I said smoothly, tapping my nails lightly against the polished surface of the table, "I want to hear it from you. Why are you here, Richard?" His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing as he fought against his own pride. He had never been good at admitting weakness. I almost wanted to savor the moment, to let him squirm a little longer, but I was patient. I had waited 5 years for this. Finally, after a heavy pause, he exhaled. "Reed and Comey has an offer on the table," he said, his voice clipped. "A generous one." I raised a brow, feigning curiosity. "Oh?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "We're in a difficult position," he admitted, though every syllable seemed to cost him. Market shifts, investor uncertainty, it's made things challenging. But an acquisition under Reed and Koning could be beneficial for both parties. Beneficial for both parties. The gall of it. He was still trying to play it as though this wasn't a desperate plea. I leaned back in my chair, tilting my head slightly as I studied him. That's an interesting way to phrase it, I mused. From where I'm sitting, it looks less like a mutually beneficial arrangement and more like a last resort. His fingers curled against the table. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. I let out a quiet hum, letting my gaze flick over the other executives seated beside him. None of them met my eyes. They all knew. They all understood that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a lifeline. And I was the one deciding whether to throw it or let them sink. But I wasn't interested in just winning. I was interested in making him understand what it felt like to be powerless. So tell me, Richard, I said, my voice calm, controlled. Why should I save you? Richard's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his eyes flickering with something dangerously close to frustration. 5 years ago, he would have cut me off mid-sentence, dismissed my words like they meant nothing. But now he couldn't afford to. I could see the struggle on his face, the push and pull between pride and necessity. He hated this, hated sitting across from me, waiting for my verdict, hated that he was the one at a disadvantage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply. Because it's a smart business decision, he said, the edge creeping back into his voice. Your company has the capital, and we have the infrastructure. Together, we could create something stronger. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Stronger, I repeated, tilting my head. That's a fascinating way to frame it. I'm curious, Richard. When you dismissed me 5 years ago, when you told me I wasn't leadership material, did you ever consider that I might build something strong enough to overshadow you? His jaw clenched. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You see, I've spent the past 5 years proving something, not just to you, but to myself, that I deserved more than the scraps you offered, that I could create something from the ground up and make it thrive in ways you never imagined. I paused, letting the words settle between us. And now you're asking me to fold you into that success. A muscle in his cheek twitched. This isn't personal, he muttered. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. No, Richard. For you, it's survival. But for me, I tapped my fingers against the table. It is personal. Silence filled the room. The other executives barely breathed. I could see it in their eyes. They knew I held all the power here. And the truth was, I could let them sink. I could watch the company that had dismissed me crumble under its own weight, let Richard Calloway fade into irrelevance. But that would be too easy. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment stretch before I spoke again. Here's the deal, I said. I won't acquire your company, not as a whole. Richard's head snapped up, his brows drawing together. What? I'll take pieces of it, the assets, the resources that benefit Reed & Co. I let my gaze drift over the table, pausing on the executives who had once been so quick to nod along with Richard's decisions. But your leadership team, your legacy, that's staying behind. His face drained of color. You're dismantling us. No, I corrected, my tone razor sharp. I'm dismantling you. His breath hitched. The realization of what I was saying finally settled in. I wasn't just rejecting his plea, I was erasing him from the equation. I straightened, smoothing my hands over my blazer. If you'd like, I can have my legal team draft the terms by the end of the day. Of course, that means you'll be out, effective immediately. I gave him a pointed look. But I'm sure you saw that coming. Richard stared at me, his hands gripping the table like it was the only thing anchoring him. For the first time, I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. Not arrogance, not condescension, defeat, and it was intoxicating. Richard looked like a man standing at the edge of a crumbling cliff, scrambling for footing that no longer existed. His fingers curled into fists, his breathing uneven. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, convinced that his power, his influence, his ability to manipulate people would always keep him ahead. But now, he wasn't ahead. He was at my mercy. I let the silence linger, watching the emotions flicker across his face. Anger, disbelief, something dangerously close to desperation. He had always been good at hiding his weaknesses, but now, stripped of control, they bled through every forced breath. "You can't do this," he said finally, voice low, almost pleading. "You're making a mistake." I raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" He nodded stiffly, grasping for some kind of leverage. "You think this is a victory, but tearing down a company out of spite won't serve you in the long run." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Spite?" I repeated, savoring the word. "You think this is about spite?" I leaned in slightly, letting my voice drop just enough to make him listen. "This is about consequences, Richard. This is Eleanor Reed." A familiar voice, low and rough, came through the line. "Congratulations, Eleanor." A slow, deliberate pause. "I always knew you'd come for me eventually." My grip on the phone tightened. Richard. He was calling me. My heart should have been steady. I should have been unaffected. But something in his tone, something I couldn't quite place, sent a ripple of unease through me. "What do you want?" I asked, coldly. A chuckle. Not bitter, not angry, just amused. "To remind you," he said, voice smooth, calculated, "that power never stays in one place for long." And then, before I could respond, the line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, sharp and final. I pulled the phone away, staring at it for a moment, as if it might offer some kind of explanation. But there was nothing, just the weight of his words echoing in my mind. Power never stays in one place for long. It was a threat, or maybe a warning. Either way, I didn't like it. I exhaled slowly, placing the phone back on its receiver with deliberate control. Richard had lost. That wasn't up for debate. He had walked out of this building a ruined man, his career in shambles. I had crushed him under my heel, just as he had once tried to do to me. So why did he sound so calm? I forced myself to shake it off. He was trying to get under my skin, trying to rattle me. That was who he was, always playing games, always making people second-guess themselves. I wasn't going to let him win, not now, not after everything. A knock on my office door pulled me out of my thoughts. My assistant, Claire, stepped inside, holding a folder. "Everything is in motion," she said, professional and composed as always. "The legal team is finalizing the paperwork. Once Calloway signs, his company will be fully absorbed." I nodded, taking the folder from her. The end was official now, or at least it would be once his signature was on the dotted line dot. Claire hesitated. "There's something else." I glanced up. "What?" She shifted slightly as if debating whether to tell me. "Richard didn't leave the building right away. He lingered in the lobby for a while, just standing there." A strange chill crept along my spine. "Did he say anything?" "No, just watch people come and go, and then he left." I frowned. It wasn't like Richard to sit in silence. He was a man who acted, who maneuvered. The idea of him simply waiting unnerved me. "Keep an eye on things," I said finally. "If anything seems off, I want to know about it." Claire nodded, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing. Something didn't feel right. That night, I tried to lose myself in work, drowning out the lingering unease with contracts and numbers and the steady rhythm of success. But no matter how many emails I answered, no matter how many deals I approved, Richard's words echoed in my mind. Power never stays in one place for long. What did he mean by that? At midnight, I finally gave up and shut my laptop. The city skyline stretched beyond my office window, glittering and endless. This was my empire now. I had built it, fought for it, bled for it. No one, not Richard, not anyone, was going to take it from me. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. Tomorrow, he'd sign the final paperwork, and this would all be over. But deep down, I knew the truth. Richard Calloway wasn't the type to go quietly. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, needing to reassert my control over the situation. The unease from Richard's call still lingered in the back of my mind, but I refused to let it affect me. He was nothing now, a washed-up executive with no company, no leverage, no power. Whatever game he thought he was playing, I wasn't going to let him win. I stepped into my office and immediately sensed something was wrong. Claire was already inside, waiting, a tight expression on her face. That wasn't normal. She usually greeted me at my desk, not standing anxiously by the window like she had been pacing for hours. She turned the moment I entered. There's a problem. I set my bag down, keeping my posture composed. What is it? She hesitated just long enough for my stomach to tighten. Richard hasn't signed the paperwork. My fingers curled slightly. Excuse me? He sent an email early this morning. Claire pulled out her tablet, swiping to bring it up. He's refusing to sign unless you meet with him. Alone. I exhaled sharply, forcing down the irritation rising inside me. He's stalling. This is a desperate attempt to make himself feel important. That's what I thought, too. Claire's voice was measured, but there was a trace of something else in her tone. Until I checked something else. She hesitated again. He's already in the building. I stilled. What? He showed up half an hour ago. Security said he walked in like he owned the place. The chill from last night returned, settling deep into my bones. Richard had lost. He knew that. And yet, here he was, still playing a game I didn't yet understand. I glanced at the email Claire had pulled up on her screen. Eleanor, I assume you expected me to simply fade away. I won't. If you want my signature, you'll meet me. No lawyers, no board members. Just you and me. We have unfinished business. Conference room 17, 9 a.m. Don't be late. I read it twice, my pulse steady, but my thoughts anything but. The arrogance in his tone was still there, but it was different now. Less about control, more about inevitability. Claire cleared her throat. You don't have to do this. Yes, I did. Not because I needed his signature. I could find a legal way around that if necessary. Not because I was afraid of him. Richard was a defeated man, with no real power left. I had to do this because something didn't add up. And I needed to know what it was. At exactly 9 a.m., I walked into conference room 17. Richard was already there, sitting casually at the head of the table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked different. Not just in the way exhaustion had settled into his features, but in his entire demeanor. The sharp confidence he once carried had shifted into something else, something calmer, more patient. Like a man who knew something I didn't. Eleanor, he said smoothly, gesturing to the seat across from him. Right on time. I didn't sit. What do you want, Richard? He smiled slightly. To talk, like adults. I folded my arms. Sign the paperwork. You don't have leverage anymore. That's where you're wrong. He took a slow sip of his coffee, watching me over the rim of the cup. I have something you want. The only question is, how badly do you want it? I clenched my jaw. What are you talking about? He set his coffee down, leaning forward. You built Reed & Company on more than just ambition, Eleanor. You built it on strategy, ruthlessness. You made all the right moves at all the right times. He tilted his head. But even the best players make mistakes. A flicker of unease crept in. Get to the point. His lips curved slightly. The SEC got an anonymous tip this morning. My heart skipped a beat. What? Something about questionable financial maneuvers, he mused, tapping a finger against the table. Acquisition deals that don't quite add up. Potentially fraudulent activity. He shrugged. I'm sure it's nothing. A slow, sinking realization settled in my chest. He had set a trap. A damn good one. I didn't move, didn't react. Just held my ground as if the weight of his words hadn't just crashed into me like a freight train. Richard watched me carefully, that slight smirk still playing on his lips. He knew. He knew exactly what buttons to press. I took a slow breath, keeping my expression neutral. That's a bold claim, I said. One you'd have to prove. He chuckled. Oh, Eleanor, you don't think I'd come to this meeting without proof, do you? He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek black USB drive, and set it on the table between us. Everything the SEC would need to tear your company apart, right here. A calculated bluff? Maybe. But I couldn't afford to take that risk. I stared at the USB, mind racing. There was no way he had real evidence, because there wasn't any. Every decision I'd made had been clean, above board. Aggressive, sure. But legal? Less. A cold realization settled in Dot. Unless someone had given him something. Falsified reports, manipulated numbers. A well-crafted lie planted just deep enough to make it look real. Dot. And if the SEC got hold of that, it wouldn't matter if it was fake. The investigation alone could cripple me. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching my expression shift. You understand now, don't you? He murmured. You thought you won, thought you crushed me. But power, Eleanor, power doesn't work that way. It shifts. It moves. He gestured between us. And right now it's moving back in my direction. My fingers twitched at my side, but I didn't let him see the frustration creeping in. Instead, I forced myself to mirror his calm. So what's your play here, Richard? Blackmail? You think I'm going to roll over because you waved a USB stick in my face? I don't expect you to roll over, he said, tilting his head slightly. I expect you to listen. To what? To my terms. I let out a short, humorless laugh. You think you get to negotiate? You're finished, Richard? And yet, here we are. He gestured around the room. You came because you know I still have the ability to hurt you. His gaze sharpened. Now, the way I see it, we have two options. One, you let this go to the SEC, deal with the fallout, watch Reed and Company get dragged through months of legal scrutiny. He shrugged. Even if you come out clean, the damage will be done. Investors spook easily. You'd lose millions if you're lucky. I clenched my jaw. Or, he spread his hands. We settle things between us. No lawyers, no investigations, just an agreement. I eyed him warily. What kind of agreement? He smiled. You let me walk away with something. My stomach twisted. You want money, Richard chuckled, shaking his head. I don't need your money, Eleanor. I need a future. His fingers drummed lazily against the table. You're acquiring my company. That means you control everything I built. My people, my assets, my name. His eyes darkened. I want a stake, a position, a seat back at the table. I stared at him. You want a job? I want a piece of what you took from me. His voice was smooth, but there was steel underneath it. You keep Reed and Company intact. I keep my hands off the SEC trigger. And in return, I get a new role, an executive position, influence, a future. The sheer audacity of it was almost laughable. I had spent years clawing my way to the top, fighting men like him, destroying every obstacle in my path. And now, when I finally had my victory, he wanted to sit at my table, ? No, absolutely not, . But he had me cornered. If he had fabricated evidence, I'd spend months, maybe years, trying to clear my name. Even if I won, the damage would be permanent. I had built Reed and Company to last. I wasn't going to let it crumble now. I exhaled slowly. "You want back in?" I said. "Fine. But if you even think about crossing me, Richard." He smirked, picking up the USB drive and slipping it back into his pocket. "Oh, Eleanor," he murmured. "I wouldn't dare." And just like that, the power shifted again. Richard thought he had won, thought he had backed me into a corner, leaving me no choice but to give him exactly what he wanted. But what he failed to realize, what he had always failed to realize, was that I had been playing this game far longer than he had, and I never made a move without a backup plan. I let him believe he had me, let him sit comfortably in his delusion that he was back in control. And while he was basking in that temporary victory, I was setting the final pieces of my plan in motion. 3 weeks later, the reckoning arrived. It started with a simple press release, one that sent shockwaves through the industry. Reed and Company had conducted an internal review and discovered evidence of fraudulent activity tied to the previous administration of Callaway Enterprises. As a responsible entity, we had no choice but to cooperate with authorities and provide all necessary documentation to ensure justice was served. Richard's name was all over those documents. His signature on falsified reports, his approvals on misallocated funds. The beautiful part. I hadn't created any of it. I'd simply hired the best forensic accountants in the business, turned them loose, and waited. Richard had built his empire on manipulation and deceit. There was no need to fabricate evidence when the truth was already damning enough. By the time the SEC got involved, it was already too late for him. Investigations were launched, media outlets ran wild with the story, and investors dropped his name like a plague. And just when Richard thought it couldn't get worse, the final blow landed. During a high-profile hearing, he was the one who had to sit in front of a packed room of reporters, cameras flashing in his face, and answer for his crimes. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced with something I had never seen before: fear. I watched from the back of the room as he struggled to keep his composure. For years, he had dismissed me, undermined me, taken what was mine without a second thought. And now, he was the one squirming under the weight of his own corruption. The board of Callaway Enterprises, what was left of it, issued a swift statement, cutting ties with him entirely. His assets were frozen. His name was disgraced. The empire he had once controlled had crumbled into nothing. And me. I walked out of that hearing with my head held high, my company untouchable, my reputation unscathed. Richard Callaway had tried to take me down, but in the end, he had only destroyed himself. A week later, I received an email from him. The subject line was blank. I didn't bother opening it. There was nothing left to say. I had won, and he knew it.